Hey folks, Abby here. It is about 11:30 a.m. on Tuesday, the 17th of January, 2023, and I am in the city of Cusco, Peru, where things are really very calm and very chill right now. In part, that is probably because a lot of people, it looks like it is a lot of people, tens of thousands, maybe over 100,000 across the entire country, are heading in convoys to the city of Lima, the capital of Peru. And that is where they plan to make a large protest on Thursday, the 19th, which is also called for as a national strike. They're calling it a Marcha de los Cuatro Suyos, a March of the Four Suyos. And for those who don't know, the Four Suyos, or the Tawantinsuyo, the 4-in-1 nation, were the four nations of the Inca Empire. And so, in other words, basically that is the Indigenous Peoples March. I'm fairly tapped into the news that's going around in Quechua because I speak Quechua on account of having grown up in a Quechua community, of which my parents were inscribed members and, all of that sort of thing. So that's happening right now. Some news that has come in from those convoys is that the one from Andahuaylas, which is where the first round of deaths in the current civil unrest episodes took place. And apparently what happened there is that in Pisco, on the way to Lima, those convoys got stopped at a checkpoint, and all of the drivers, or a large number of the drivers, were detained while all of the paperwork and licenses and records and registrations and everything for all of the vehicles were investigated and checked up on. And according to some accounts, this was a matter of hours. According to other accounts, it was a couple of days. So probably there are multiple things that took place. Apparently they were all released shortly after midnight this morning, so overnight, and are continuing along the way. So one of the reasons why they are all traveling in convoys is for protection in the event of anything like that, protection in numbers, and also to be sure that everybody keeps their cool, and to minimize the likelihood of anybody just flying off the handle or any rogue actors interfering or what have you. There are some reports kind of going around that say that this is all foreign instigated, and I find that hard to believe personally, simply because the people who I personally know who are active in a lot of these protests are not people who have contact with foreign influence. So is it possible that there is foreign produced propaganda? Absolutely. There is propaganda on every side of this whole thing going around. For the most part, Peruvians are pretty good at identifying propaganda because it actually is something that was taught in grade school in the 70s, 80s, and on into the 90s. So I don't know necessarily how common it is today. People talk a lot about whether or not everyone is getting the civics education that they used to, like when we were kids. I went all the way through primary school in Peru, in rural Peru. So I know what kind of education that was. And I will just say that whenever we would go to the U.S. and I would have to take tests for placement in terms of what I knew, let's just say I skipped an entire grade and some other stuff. So Peruvian education is a little bit more accelerated, has been a little bit more accelerated, has a lot of content packed into 11 years, generally speaking. So anyway, all of that aside, yeah, Peruvians are pretty good at spotting propaganda, and because there was a lot of it in the 70s and 80s. I mean, a lot, like a lot. So much, and from so many different perspectives. And this was why it was sort of thought at the time that it was a good idea to educate Peruvian kids about what major socioeconomic movements were, and a lot of that kind of stuff, because you had like all of them active in Peru. It was a free-for-all, politically speaking. Anyway, I mean, I guess compared to some other places in the world, Peru still seems like a political free-for-all. Like, there were 19 parties in the last presidential election in 2021, and the guy who won, who was recently impeached, just like all the presidents in the past 5 or 6 years have been. Anyway, the guy who won was from an openly communist left-wing party and that kind of thing. And he won against an openly right-wing party where the presidential candidate is the daughter of the last dictator to have a dictatorship in Peru after he did the first self-coup and seized power in the 1990s. And anyway, there's a whole lot of really complicated history in Peruvian politics. And it would take more time to cover it all than we would have in a day if I sat here and spent an entire day just talking about the history of Peruvian politics. We couldn't possibly get into all of it, but we might scratch the surface enough to sort of have a good basis to form opinions on. So anyway, Peru right now is a very deeply divided country, and it is deeply divided in some very interesting ways that include along racial, ethnic, and class lines. And oh boy, is that all sticky stuff. The politics of race and class in Peru are also pretty complicated, and they're not easy for people to understand outside of the former Spanish Empire, I guess, even within all of that kind of stuff. So who is on the road for this march that is expected to take place in Lima on the 19th, this coming Thursday, or the day after tomorrow? And who is calling for national strike, as in everywhere in the country, on the same day? Glad you asked. It is a whole lot of consortiums of labor leaders and organizers. It is people who hold political office in a number of places. And it is labor unions, and it is primarily, I'm going to say, really heavily leaning towards people who are indigenous, so identifying with Quechua, Aymara, Ashaninka, and other indigenous Peruvian ethnic and cultural groups. So this is complicated too because, class mobility became a thing starting with the agrarian reform that was launched in the late 1960s and that began its real execution in the 1970s and continued along through the 1980s, and many would say that there are aspects of it that are still in place. And one of the things that was a key platform for ex-President Castillo, who was just removed from office on December 7th, was that he said he was going to do a second agrarian reform, and that was going to constitute the nationalization of contracts that are up for renewal this year and soon, and where the concessions to operate a number of these things, which include mining and tourism and big money businesses, are up for renewal. And he said that he was going to not give those concessions to foreign investment and foreign operators this time around, that they were going to have to be Peruvian held. And that sounded great to people who live in the areas where there's a lot of mining, where there's a lot of tourism, but where people who are sort of ordinary folks haven't necessarily felt that they have reaped the benefit of the money that changes hands in those industries. And so that's a lot of who is on the march. People who feel like, given the amount of copper, for example, Peru is the number 2 producer of copper in the world, that is being removed from the areas where they live, and what that's causing in terms of pollution, in terms of loss of land and land rights, in terms of a lot of things like that. Those are folks who feel that they should be seeing more economic benefit coming their way from that. Or people who live in, Cusco, for example, where I live and where I grew up. Cusco is a region, so that is like, think of it as a state, and then inside of that there are provinces, and inside of that there are municipalities, is basically the overview of how that works. Anyway, so there is a it's like New York, right? There is a Cusco city inside the province of Cusco, which is inside the region of Cusco. So anyway, so people in Cusco, in the whole region of Cusco, heavily see a lot of the money that comes into the area being from tourism businesses, and many of those concessions are owned by foreign or multinational interests. And so people feel strongly that they don't see the benefit of a lot of that, or that they get like a pittance of it, even when people do make their living from tourism. And so that becomes a really tricky thing. And so people are saying things like, oh yeah, everybody loves to come to Cusco and go to Machu Picchu and see all the people dressed up in colorful clothes and doing fancy indigenous dances, but, let someone start actually speaking Quechua in Congress, and now it's a problem, right? And so there's a lot of that kind of sentiment that has been going around over the past almost 2 years, since the presidential elections of 2021 started really ramping up campaign stuff and everything. Anyway, so there's a whole lot of complexity to this. So is everybody in Cusco, where I live, totally down with the idea that protests should be happening and the country should be shut down? No, there's a lot of difference of opinion, and it falls along class and economic lines, right? So what we've seen is a lot of people coming in from the country and protesting in the city of Cusco, but the regional government and most of the provincial governments are of the opinion that the things being protested for are correct, right? Are what should be happening. And the things being protested for at this point are, number one, for the killings to stop. 50 people have been killed in the protesting since December 7th. And so that is just a little over a month, a month and 10 days, right? So that's a lot. That is more than one person per day, except that some of those have been in the form of what people are calling massacres, which I think is probably fair, where like 19 people have been killed in a matter of hours, for example. And this has raised concern for human rights organizations worldwide who are talking about, maybe trying to put some pressure on the government of Peru to maybe stop being so killy. And that kind of stuff is going on. So then, in addition, they want to see Congress closed. Congress has an 88% disapproval rating. The president right now has I think it's 79% disapproval rating. And so that is a lot. That's pretty bad. So neither the president nor Congress has a high approval rating, and ousted President Castillo actually had a higher approval rating, but nobody is talking about him at this point. Like, he is largely forgotten, because at this point, mostly what people who are protesting are saying is, okay, we cannot have somebody stay in office as president who has presided over this amount of killing of citizens. And then people who support the president are saying, well, we can't have this kind of civil unrest disrupting our economy and essential things, and even regular people can't survive if they can't go to work because there are roadblocks, because there's no tourism, because 90 to 95% of tourist plans have been canceled since December, if all of that kind of stuff is happening. So, like I say, highly divided. And I focused more on explaining what is going on in the thought process of the people who are protesting than I did on the people who are in favor of the government, because as I am looking at the English language media around the world, I'm seeing that side of things where there is support for the present government of Peru be more clearly represented. I'm also seeing things be discussed in the context of protesters being primarily supporters of ousted President Castillo. And that's not entirely the whole of the story. I wouldn't say that that is entirely accurate at this point. Nobody is calling for him to be reinstated. Some people are calling for him to be released from jail. But what people want is an end to the killings. They want Congress to shut down and new congressional elections, and they want the president to step down and new presidential elections, and they want them soon. Like they have been, there has been a proposal made by the president to move them forward 2 years to April of 2024, and for most people who are protesting, they don't think that that is soon enough. And so there are ways that it could be possible constitutionally to have elections sooner, but totally by the book, sometime between December 2023 and April of 2024 would be the normal span of time if processes were set in motion to have new elections right now, to have elections moved up. So there would need to be other emergency decisions made to move those up, and those would require both the executive and legislative branches of government to take action to make that happen. And neither of those branches seems very interested in relinquishing any of the power that they currently have right now, despite the fact that they have these amazingly low approval rates. And one of the reasons why they have these low approval rates is because so many people are just not okay with the spilling of blood that's been going on with all of this. So anyway, as I say, right now, today, the 17th of January, 2023, coming up on the 12 o'clock hour in the city of Cusco, it is pretty chill. It is pretty calm. I went out for a walk. I had a nice breakfast at a kind of hipster cafe where I had, avocado toast and all of that good stuff, right? And a really good cappuccino. And went for a nice walk, and everything was open, and stores and markets were restocking and resupplying, and prices on essential goods were starting to come back down from the skyrocketing point that they were at when things were really heavy last week, which is not the only time that they've been fairly heavy, but they were really heavy last week. And so things are looking pretty decent here. And then I got home and I was taking a look at the news, and there was an announcement from the president who says blocking roads, which is a major protest activity that a lot of groups have engaged in, is outside the scope of Pacific protest, and that one way or another the government plans to open all the roadblocks and open all the roadways in Peru starting today, which suggests that the plan for doing so may be through use of force. So one of the things that seems to mystify a lot of people here in the south of Peru, at any rate, is why it seems like every decision that this government makes is one that is bound and determined to escalate the situation, as opposed to move towards conciliation and a calming of protests or anything like that. And yeah, I think that's a good question. On the other hand, people who are in Lima and who are faced with the idea that a very, very large number of protesters from the country are coming into the city, are perhaps more interested in seeing a military solution as opposed to one based in dialogue, so that they don't run the risk of having their lives disrupted the way that lives in provinces where protests have been concentrated over the past month and change have had their lives disrupted, our lives disrupted. Although the disruptions to our routines are really nothing compared to the loss of life and the injuries, which are substantial. It's anybody's guess where this goes. There are absolutely ways that dialogue could happen and things could be de-escalated and diplomatic solutions could be arrived at. And the question is just whether or not that is the way that things are going to go down. And that is, like I say, unfortunately, anybody's guess right now. So for the most part, remember, people live through all of this kind of thing. And one of the things to know about civil unrest is it's not like it's an action movie all the time with just crazy shit happening in the streets nonstop. Most of the time, your life goes on and you just have to pay too much for chicken, or the cost of, gas to run your stove is like, oh my God, I can't believe that's what it costs. Or, you can't get the specific brand of medicine that you expect and you have to deal with generic, or, this is sort of the way that it is. And it isn't like, it is not like a constant ongoing action movie. It is your regular life interspersed with there being thousands of people in the streets. And potentially you come around the corner and there is some tear gassing happening. And, so you've got to continue on with your life. And that's absolutely the case. But so the folks who are protesting, what they're saying is stuff like, I didn't want to go protest. My family doesn't want me to go protest because of the risks of things. But at the same time, we know somebody's got to do it, because if nobody stands up against what they are perceiving as an oppressive regime, then, all of the gains of the past 60 some odd years in terms of equality, in terms of economic improvement, improvements in access to education, and a lot of that kind of stuff, right, are going to be for nothing. They're going to be lost. And so it's some heavy shit that's going down. And it's hard to say what's going to happen right now. For my part, this afternoon I'm going to go out with my nephew and we are going to go to a music store and find out what saxophones cost, because he wants to save up for a saxophone. And I, as a person who has played saxophone and whatnot, fully support this concept. So we're going to go out and do that and try and not just spend too much time watching the news and obsessing about all this kind of stuff, which is really hard, because you want to be clued in on what's going to happen, but it's also very anxiety inducing. And then, people want to know what's going to happen. And I want to know that too. I wish I could tell you. So I make the best guesses I can. And sometimes my guesses are on the mark and other times they're not. And I think that's the way it is. So did I foresee when I went out for breakfast that I was going to come back and the president was going to have said, well, we are going to use force or whatever it takes to end all the roadblocks and the protests at the same time as there is a large convoy, many large convoys headed for Lima? No, I didn't. That was not on my bingo card for today. I don't think that means that we're going to see the military roll into the music shops and start tear gassing people shopping for saxophones, but who knows? So then the question becomes, what are the precautions that we take for getting around and that kind of thing. And so if you are a tourist, if you are not somebody who lives here, if you are not somebody who is really comfortable in in all of these spaces. Stay in the tourist areas. Don't plan on traveling from town to town, and don't get involved, because it is illegal for people who are not Peruvian citizens to be involved in protest. And I guess that is the update. I think things are probably going to stay fairly calm until the 19th, the day after tomorrow. And then we'll probably see like exactly how widespread this protest action is that day. And then Friday, I don't know. I do not know. So next week, also don't know. Again, things could happen that would provide diplomatic solutions and really calm things down. But as it stands, those are not the decisions we are seeing the Peruvian government make. And so that is concerning. So then people are saying, well, what about a month from now, 2 months from now, 3 months from now? And I am banking, literally, betting the livelihood of me and my family on it being fine in May. And I truly believe that it will be fine in May, although I don't know exactly how. Because I believe that the vast majority of the people of Peru want peaceful and diplomatic solutions to all of this, and don't want to see it come to anything worse than what we have already seen. So that's where things are at. And as far as is it dangerous for me to go out and go saxophone shopping with my nephew? No. I would say 99% no. 99.9% no. I would say it is not any more dangerous than getting in a car in Cincinnati and driving to the supermarket, right? But that's not a zero risk proposition either. So, that's the thing. I would say if you have a really tight schedule that you want to do tourist activities on, now is probably not the time. You need to be flexible and you need to be open to schedule change. But the other thing there is if you can be, then this is actually a great time to do tourist stuff in Cusco, because everybody really needs the money, and because it's not a mob scene. So you can get in to fantastic experiences you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. My BFF, who just returned to the USA after visiting for almost a month, she and I went out on Sunday evening, and we were the only people in a world-class restaurant, and we just got amazing service and fantastic food and all of that kind of stuff. And those kind of things, the kinds of things are possible right now. There are people who have been stuck in Machu Picchu for days, with the end result of that being that instead of having 2 hours to be rushed through the site, like it's some Disneyland attraction, they've gotten to actually go and check it out and explore and enjoy the trip in ways that usually are simply not possible. So, if you have some tolerance for a little bit of uncertainty in your schedule, then this is a very interesting time to visit the Cusco area. But you do have to be prepared to keep a cool head. And to not get frustrated if your day-to-day schedule is somewhat disrupted. Anyway, I guess that is the upshot of the situation from here in Cusco right now, and I'll keep you posted.